Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're going to be diving deep into Seneca's On Anger. It's a fascinating look into one of the most powerful and, let's be honest, challenging emotions we humans grapple with.
It really is. And, it's remarkable how relevant Seneca's insights remain even after all these centuries. I mean, he really gets to the core of what anger is and how it affects us, and crucially, how we can try to manage it.
Right, and he doesn't sugarcoat anything. He goes right to the heart of it, defining anger as a temporary madness. Have you ever felt that overwhelming surge of rage, where it's like your rational mind just completely shuts down? That's exactly what Seneca's talking about.
Yeah, he paints this really vivid picture of anger's effects. Flushed face, rapid breathing, that all-consuming desire for revenge. And it's like he's holding up a mirror, forcing us to confront the stark reality of what anger does to us.
Yeah, it's definitely not a flattering reflection.
Yeah.
But Seneca doesn't just focus on the individual experience, though.
Mhm.
He takes us on this historical tour, showing how unchecked anger has led to wars, assassinations, the downfall of entire civilizations. Like, remember his account of the Cimbrians and Teutons?
Oh, yeah.
Entire tribes wiped out,
Yeah.
with only rumors reaching their homelands. It's a sobering reminder of how anger on a large scale can be absolutely devastating.
And seeing those consequences, it makes you question, is this kind of destructive rage even natural to us? Seneca argues that it isn't. He believes that humans are naturally inclined toward kindness and cooperation, making anger a deviation from our true nature.
That's a bold claim.
Yeah.
It seems counterintuitive, right? I mean, we all experience anger. It's a natural human emotion.
Now, of course, we feel anger, but Seneca distinguishes between feeling it and letting it control us. He acknowledges that correction and punishment can be necessary, but they should be driven by reason and a desire for healing, not by anger itself. Think of it like a doctor treating a patient. They start with mild remedies and only resort to more drastic measures when absolutely necessary. The goal is always to restore balance, not to inflict pain out of anger.
That's a great analogy. It highlights the difference between acting with intention and just reacting impulsively. So if anger isn't necessary for things like justice or correction, what about the idea that it's essential for courage and action, especially in war? Isn't a bit of righteous anger what drives soldiers to fight for their country?
That's a common belief, and Seneca tackles it head-on. He argues that true courage doesn't need anger as a crutch. He believes that reason alone is sufficient to motivate courageous action. He even gives us examples from Roman history. Generals like Fabius and Scipio who achieved victory through strategy and patience, not blind rage.
He famously says, "Virtue being self-sufficient never needs the help of vice."
Right.
It's a powerful statement that really makes you think about the nature of true strength. It's not about brute force or giving in to rage, but about acting with wisdom and restraint.
Exactly. And Seneca backs it up by showing how anger often leads to rash decisions and ultimately self-destruction. He cites historical figures whose anger contributed to their downfall, like that anecdote about Gaius Caesar getting so enraged during a thunderstorm that he challenged Jove to a duel.
Yeah, that's a bit much even for a Roman emperor.
Yeah.
It's almost comical, but also a bit terrifying to think about a leader with that level of impulsivity.
Right. Seneca uses that example to show the absurdity of letting anger dictate our actions. It's a stark contrast to the image of true greatness he puts forth, one characterized by reason, tranquility, and unwavering goodness. And this brings us to another crucial point. What about feeling anger when loved ones are harmed? Surely that kind of anger is justified, right? It's natural to want to protect those we care about. It's natural, absolutely. But even in those situations, Seneca argues that a truly good person acts out of a sense of justice and duty, not blind rage. He encourages us to consider the root cause of wrongdoing, recognizing that error, not malice, is often at play. He advocates for compassion, even towards those who've wronged us, urging us to see them as lost souls needing guidance rather than objects of our wrath.
So instead of reacting with anger, we should try to understand where they're coming from and help them find their way back to the right path.
Exactly, and that takes us to the heart of Seneca's message. He's not saying we should be passive in the face of injustice. He's advocating for a more reasoned and measured response, one guided by principles rather than just the whims of emotion. And that leads us to the practical side of his philosophy. How do we actually manage this powerful emotion? What can we do to prevent anger from controlling our lives?
That's what I'm really curious about. It's one thing to understand the philosophy, but how do we put it into practice? What specific strategies does Seneca offer?
Well, he provides a whole toolkit, really. One of the first things he emphasizes is understanding our triggers. He urges us to identify those situations, people, or even thoughts that tend to ignite our anger. You know, those things that just push our
Right,
buttons.
it's like knowing your enemy, right? If you can anticipate what's going to set you off, you can start to develop strategies for dealing with those triggers more effectively.
Precisely. And Seneca offers some surprisingly practical advice. He suggests avoiding those who are prone to anger themselves. Their negativity can be contagious. He even cautions against spending too much time dwelling on cruelty and violence, whether in books or the news, as this can fuel our own aggressive tendencies.
That's interesting. It's like he's saying we need to be mindful of the information we consume. What we feed our minds can have a direct impact on our emotional state.
Absolutely. And he goes even further, suggesting we deliberately expose ourselves to situations that test our patience, but in a controlled way, of course. He uses the analogy of a soldier training for battle. By practicing restraint in smaller skirmishes, we build up the strength to remain calm in the face of larger threats.
I love that. It's like emotional weightlifting for the soul, strengthening our inner resilience through deliberate practice. And this leads to another key element, cultivating a more philosophical outlook. What does Seneca mean by that?
For Seneca, a life guided by reason and virtue is the key to tranquility and happiness. He urges us to shift our perspective, to focus on what truly matters, and detach ourselves from the fleeting and trivial things that often fuel our anger.
So rising above those petty annoyances and focusing on the bigger picture.
Exactly. Seneca reminds us that much of what we get angry about is ultimately insignificant. He encourages us to adopt a more stoic mindset, to accept what we cannot control, and focus our energy on living a virtuous life.
How does that stoic mindset actually help us deal with anger in those heated moments?
It creates a buffer between our emotions and our reactions. When you encounter something that might normally trigger your anger, you can pause, reflect, and choose a more measured response.
It's like that space between stimulus and response we hear so much about these days.
Precisely. And Seneca was advocating for this kind of mindful approach centuries ago. He reminds us that we always have a choice in how we respond. We can be ruled by our anger, or we can choose to be guided by reason.
But isn't there a danger in suppressing our anger? Don't we need to express it in some way?
That's a common concern, and Seneca addresses it directly. He distinguishes between feeling anger and acting on it. It's natural to experience anger, but the key is to prevent it from dictating our actions. He offers some very concrete tips for doing that.
Okay, like what?
Well, he suggests delaying our reaction. When you feel that anger rising, take a step back, breathe deeply, and give yourself time to cool down before responding.
That's good advice. I know I've certainly said things in the heat of the moment that I later regretted. Taking a pause would have definitely helped in those situations. What else?
Seneca also stresses the importance of choosing our words carefully. Avoid harsh language or making threats. It only escalates the conflict and fuels our own anger.
So it's about de-escalating the situation, not adding fuel to the fire.
Exactly. And this ties into his emphasis on forgiveness. Seneca believed that holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. It only harms us in the end. He encourages us to practice forgiveness not for the other person's sake, but for our own well-being.
That's a powerful image. It really drives home the point that harboring anger is ultimately self-destructive.
He offers another analogy to illustrate this point. He compares anger to a fire. Just as a fire needs fuel to keep burning, so too does anger. If we deprive it of fuel, our thoughts, our words, our actions, it eventually dies out.
So it's about starving the anger, so to speak.
Precisely. It takes discipline and conscious effort, but the rewards of a life free from anger, as Seneca reminds us, are immeasurable. We gain tranquility, peace of mind, and a deeper understanding of ourselves and others.
It's a compelling vision, and one that I think we all aspire to in some way, but achieving that level of emotional mastery is no easy feat. What else does Seneca recommend for those of us who struggle with anger?
He encourages us to cultivate virtues that act as antidotes to anger, virtues like patience, gentleness, and humility. He also stresses the importance of finding healthy outlets for our emotions, such as physical exercise, creative pursuits, or simply spending time in nature.
So it's not just about controlling anger, it's about cultivating a lifestyle that supports inner peace.
Exactly. And that brings us to one of the most profound aspects of Seneca's philosophy. He believed that the true measure of a person's character is not how they behave when things are easy, but how they respond to challenges and adversity.
So it's not about avoiding anger altogether, it's about learning to manage it effectively when it inevitably arises.
Precisely. And that takes practice, self-awareness, and a commitment to living in accordance with our highest values.
Seneca seems to place a lot of emphasis on the idea of a good man as the ideal. How do you interpret that concept in today's world?
That's a great question. It's important to remember that Seneca was writing in a very different time and context. While the term good man might feel outdated today, I think the underlying principles are still relevant.
So it's less about gender and more about the qualities he associates with that term.
Exactly. When Seneca talks about a good man, he's essentially describing someone who embodies virtue, reason, and compassion. Someone who strives to live a life of purpose and meaning, and who responds to challenges with wisdom and grace.
That's a definition that transcends time and cultural boundaries. It's a universal ideal that we can all aspire to, regardless of our background or beliefs.
Absolutely. And that's the beauty of Seneca's work. While some of his language might feel archaic, his insights into human nature and the pursuit of a fulfilling life remain as relevant and powerful as ever. This deep dive into on anger has given me a lot to think about. It's challenged some of my assumptions about anger and presented a very different way of approaching this complex emotion.
It really has been eye-opening. But before we wrap up, I have one more question. Seneca focuses a lot on the individual experience of anger. But what about the role of anger in society? Can anger ever be a force for positive change?
That's a really important question, and it's something Seneca grapples with as well. He acknowledges that there are times when anger can be a catalyst for action, for pushing back against injustice, but he cautions us to be wary of that righteous anger because it can so easily turn into the very thing it seeks to fight.
So it's a delicate balance, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do we harness the energy of anger without letting it consume us?
Well, Seneca would argue that true change comes from a place of reason and compassion, not blind rage. Um, think about it this way. If you're trying to convince someone of your point of view, are you more likely to be successful if you're shouting and angry, or if you approach the conversation with calmness and understanding?
I see what you mean. Anger can be a powerful motivator,
Mm-hmm.
but it can also shut down dialogue and make it harder to find common ground.
Exactly. And that's why Seneca stresses the importance of channeling our anger into constructive action. Instead of lashing out, we can use our anger to fuel our efforts to create a more just and equitable world.
So maybe it's not about getting rid of anger altogether,
Yeah.
but about transforming it into something positive and productive.
That's a great way to put it. And that brings us back to the heart of Seneca's message. The path to overcoming anger is not about suppressing or denying this powerful emotion. It's about understanding its nature, recognizing its triggers, and consciously choosing a different path. A path guided by reason, compassion, and a commitment to our own inner peace.
That's a powerful message, and one that I think really encapsulates the essence of Seneca's philosophy. He's not offering a quick fix, but a journey of self-discovery and transformation.
Precisely. And like any journey, it requires effort, patience, and a willingness to learn and grow. But the rewards are well worth the effort. A life free from anger's grip is a life filled with greater tranquility, clarity, and purpose.
Well, this deep dive into on anger has been incredibly insightful. It's given me a new perspective on this emotion and provided some really practical tools for managing it more effectively.
Great.
I really appreciate your insights.
It's been my pleasure, and I hope our listeners found it equally valuable.
Well, on that note, we'll leave you to continue your own exploration of Seneca's profound insights. Until next time, keep